Okay, I'm sharing my screen so I can explain you what I did exactly, if I remember. So, okay, you should see it. So basically, I've been working, as I told you before, about the immutable DTOs. But the problem with immutable DTOs is not only related to the service input processor. In the web API, it's more system-wide because once you acquire the information from the service input processor, you cannot handle internally because, for example, setting the extension attribute is based on calling the set method. So basically, we create a kind of immutable object. This is the problem that Alex is having, I think. So it's a little deeper. So I needed to basically modify all the approach to the DTO of Magento 2. That is basically passing through, I think, two main methods. I don't remember exactly where they are, but they are the data object helper. That is one of that. That has one populate from array, I'm sorry. That I basically hijacked it to a new DTO processor. This is my class. This is basically a new way of handling DTOs in Magento that both supports mutable and immutable objects. And this is made by defining, I called it Hydretos strategy. So basically it is able to automatically detect if we are handling a mutable or immutable object. And I can show you the test. Yes, I did the test. So yeah, just to explain you what I mean. So it's quite, wow, this is a very huge test. So basically, if I have a DTO like this one that is supposed to be mutable, so I inject parameter through constructor, the iterator strategy detects basically that, where is the test for this one? Iterating strategy provider, yeah. So if I try to inject, for example, param 1, 2, and 3, that basically are, yeah, the three parameters name, the iterator strategy tells us I have to do through constructor parameters. So basically, I'm dealing with an immutable object. If I try the same with, for example, let me find, this is a simple data object. Testable object should be this one. That is basically is inheriting from abstract simple objects. So is something, let's say, existing in the Magento core. The iterator strategy found a way to inject through the data constructor parameter. Otherwise, if we have a setter method, like in this case, so this is a kind of hybrid object I just did for a test. The strategy is able to detect where what parameter should be injected through constructor and what parameter should be handled using setters. I did this hybrid strategy for, I thought, for example, for migrating to mutable, from mutable to mutable, for example. So basically, using this DTO processor allows us to handle the old way and the new way. And I managed to connect this to the service input processor as well. So basically, we can use immutable DTO both for web API or internal use. And I also implemented, for example, some useful tools like create from array. So it's create updated object. So basically you take one object and you want to update the information inside this object, and you can run something like, let me show, updated. So let's say I have this DTO containing param 1, 2, 3 with these values, and I want to update, so create a new DTO with param 2 with a value of 3, I can call this method, and basically I create a new object with with the same information of the previous one, but one information is changed. So basically, it's a kind of mapping to create a new object, because of course, if you are handling immutable object, we cannot just set a new value and set a parameter.
And how are we gonna initialize the extension attributes here?
This is quite easy. I don't have tests here, but it's very similar to the custom attributes at the end. So you can do through constructor. So you just say extension attributes, and you just list all the attributes, and there is an internal method inside the DTO processor that handles this by creating the extension attribute through the factory. I couldn't write a test because I don't know how to fake one extension attribute XML file inside a test. So I have to find a way to write it, but it's handled here, extension attributes. So basically, if we are dealing with an extension attributes, we are going to create automatically and inject it both through constructor or setter method. Of course, if you're dealing with an immutable object, we are supposed to inject this using the constructor. So it is working as you saw before, using that iterator strategy. So in this case, the iterator strategy finds that you defined the extension attributes through the constructor, so it's going to inject through the constructor.
I mean, like for extension attributes, to initialize all the extension attributes, we're supposed to call the third-party services or like some method to get the proper data for particular extension attribute.
So make me an example. I'm not sure I understood what you mean.
Like, for example, let's consider we have the product and we have the extension attribute for or we have like, let's say we have the source from the MSI, and the extension attribute wants to add like hours
so
of
basically,
availability.
In this case, what you have to do is actually to create a new instance of the object with an updated information, because if you're dealing with Immutable DTO, you cannot modify it, of course. So basically, if you're going to inject extension attributes, you can use that method I showed you before. So create an updated version, updated object from factory, and you can inject extension attributes.
So that do I understand you correctly?
So this is a very
So like what
this
it
is
actually
a very
means?
strict immutable system. So it's
So what it actually means for us that in fact, let's say we would have the source with the 3 different extension attributes. So that it means that we initially will create the immutable source object, but with all the extension attributes set to null. And then when we will have the first plugin, we will clone the source object, and we will initialize one of it.
Yeah, exactly. But you should be aware, of course, of this mechanism, because, of course, you are going to take another object that is no more the previous instance. So basically, if you change something, you have to pay attention, of course, to make sure you're referring to the new object and no more to the old one, because this is a very strict immutable system.
What I'm thinking about that first, like we have 2 issues here. The first one is that we are creating too many objects, so that potentially it can lead to the performance degradation. So instead of creating like the
but we can also replace. My point, for example, was to my main problem was to make it backward compatible. The old Magento system, but we can, for example, create updated object from array, but update object from array, and source object can be a reference, for example, and we just create a new object and destroy the old one.
The second point I'm thinking about that now we can't guarantee that we have object, like a source object, created and filled with all necessary data. Because, for example, if we consider that extension attribute is mandatory for our entity, we can't guarantee this by the contract. Because we still like all our extension attributes supposed to be nullified in this case. Because initially we create them like with empty values.
You can even not, but I think you have the same problem now, even without the immutable object, because you have to fill them after you create. So basically, you don't create the object with the extension attribute inside. You just fill them later using a plugin or something like that.
Yes, but we fix this issue for the DTO interface. So we already made like, for example, for the source, so for the pickup location entity, which guys introduced for in-store
yeah,
pickup.
but we could. Why don't we use something like, for example, here the DTO processor is already supporting the join processor for the extension attribute. So we could create something like that for populating the extension attribute at object creation time.
Yeah. So my idea was that if we will move the extension point at the level of the constructor of the DTO, we potentially can launch all this. It probably wouldn't be plugins anymore. There's gonna be some DI configuration in this case, but we have the correct context to run all these services which retrieve data for the extension attributes.
My idea, Igor, just to show you, because as I told you, this is just a work in progress. My idea is to create some more advanced architecture here in this method in create from array that now is just populating and creating some kind of extension point to be used through DI. So like it happens for, you can see a line, this line, for example, is calling the join processor to populate the extension attributes. I'd like to create something to populate the extension attributes at this point, even from DI. So for example, I can call a service module, for example, to retrieve all the additional extension attribute I may need. So basically I have at constructor time or at setter time, it depends on the object.
Yeah, so that would be cool because we no need to recreate the DTO object several times, so we can just retrieve all the needed data even for extension attribute at the time of the object instantiation. And we can say that particular extension attributes, or all of them, are mandatory, so they are not nullified. So, for example, if we have the extension attribute with type integer, it's gonna be just a return int, but not like a question mark int.
Yeah, sure. I got it.
That would be.
Yeah, and I think we can easily do it. Yeah. My only point is, yeah, okay. I can inject a kind of pool from. I want to explain to you what is my point. That is, this DTO processor is called before probably the DI is initialized because it can be triggered very early in the code. So I'm not sure that you can use DI from module. I think I should inject one external class, a kind of extension attribute pool modifier, then use the DI in that class. Yeah, no,
maybe we need to say so. Here we need to look more carefully how exactly this object created. So maybe we need to introduce like extension attribute factory to the DTO and make this extension attribute factory to be an extension point for all the extension attributes being created. So maybe we can go that way.
Yeah, it makes sense. Absolutely. Yeah, it is. It's going to be even an easier way to handle extension attributes. Because today it's quite complex because you have to pluginize.
Yeah. Because
The
there is
word.
no like precise extension point, but in this case,
Yeah.
we will have the extension attribute factory, and that is gonna be kind of clear.
Yeah. So the second part, just to finish all the. Okay. Yeah. Wait. There is also another important part here. It seems to be a very side feature, but honestly, I find it very effective. Basically, is the snake case and camel case handling for parameters, because Magenta is quite confusing from this aspect, because data, for example, is going to handle snake case, while constructor parameters should be handled using camel case. This DTO processor basically normalized all the input. So you can you can specify the parameter both in snake case or camel case, so it's compatible with a service input processor that is going to handle it in camel case, and is even compatible with the data for simple objects that are using snake case. And another cool part is that I also created, of course, the get object data that is that converts, as you may imagine, the object to one array, to an associative array. And this is, of course, capable of digging even nested objects. And it automatically casts all the types. And I managed to even connect service input processor, service input processor. Still working on this. So basically, all these huge methods and a bunch of private methods will disappear, because basically it's going to pass through this DTO processor. That basically is going to be one central point of handling the DTOs. And it seems to be working. I had no time to run the whole Magento test suite. I just ran some.
In any case, then
some random test.
If you want just to play around with it, you can you can put the pull request into Magenta and mark it as a work in progress.
Yeah, I want to do that, even because I already pushed it. So I just need to create the pull request. But I just wanted to fix some final details to make it working. I mean, in a backward compatible way, because my main concern is, since I'm going to deal with data object helper, that basically is one of the central point in which Magento is going to handle the DTOs. I have to make sure I'm handling all these scenarios.
Yep, makes sense.
So this is what I did, because I didn't want to only create something that was working at web API level, because I found it very useful even in my projects to use immutable DTOs. I mean, at PHP code level, but you cannot do that with Magento. Because, for example, if you have an extension, it's just an example, you have an extension attribute that basically is an immutable DTO. Today, you cannot do that using Magento.
Yeah,
because,
sure.
Populate, because it just calls populate with array that is asking you to have setters. So basically, I had to change all my mutable objects to mutable just because of this.
Yeah, actually, you made it quite similar to the PCR7. So with all this with method, so it's pretty much like similar to PCR7, but now it leads to too many object instantiations, so potentially it can give us like the performance degradation.
Yeah, this is my concern. But this is even my concern. But as I told you, now we are using create updated object from array, but we can create a new object and delete the old one, so the memory aspect is gone. And we should also consider one thing, that one DTO should be immutable from the beginning to the end. So I don't expect this to change many times. Otherwise, it is not an immutable DTO anymore.
Mm-hmm.
So I think in our whole process, one DTO should be modified maybe 1 time, 2 times at maximum. So otherwise, there is something wrong in the architecture, I think.
Mm-hmm.
This is my idea. I mean, why you should create, for example, several copies of the same objects? It's just because I mean, when we will create this extension attributes extension point, you don't have any reason.
It like it may be like it may need if you, for example, if you introduce the changes to the object not in one place, but like in the Magenta 1 style, when you take this object, so you retrieve the DTO, and you just and several different services are responsible to modify it. So you just like throw an event and put this DTO as parameter to this event,
Yeah,
and say
okay.
that everybody who subscribed to this event are available to update this object. So that all the events subscribed start to change it, and each of these changes is actually recreation of this object. So this is definitely not the way to
Yeah.
do in Magenta 2, but if your logic is spread all over the application, and if you have like too many pieces responsible for too many pieces of the business logic responsible for update of this entity, so that you will end up recreating this object one.
Yes, but I agree with you, but it is not immutable anymore.
So actually, it's the way how you. So it depends what the pattern, creational pattern you will use, because you can still, for example, use the builder pattern, and the builder pattern will, because factory will create like the clone copy at once. But if you proceed like with the builder pattern, for example, and you will just collect all these changes, and after that you will recreate that entity and apply all the changes on top of it, and then you will actually persist the data, so that it can be like we can neglect all these changes which are applied throughout the application.
No, I understand, but basically what you can do, you can do it by simply using the abstract simple object and defining only the getter methods in your interface. So you can do even with the system. So the system does not. So you don't have to use immutable objects with the system. You can use immutable object.
Yeah.
I mean, even in the builder. So it is not immutable, because immutable is supposed to be immutable from the beginning to the end. So you create the object and it is the same. So if we need a builder pattern, for example, we should create an object like this one you can see on my right side of the screen, that is inheriting from the abstract simple object that is exposing one set data. And maybe we should define one interface that is only exposing the getters.
So it actually depends on the way. Actually, it depends on the contract how you modify the object, because potentially you can what you can introduce. You can introduce kind of factory which accepts the your DTO. So the DTO will be used as a state of the data, and on top of it you apply kind of patch with all the attribute which should be changed. And this
this is what does this method basically.
So actually, like here is the question: how the data should be represented? Whether it's gonna be, because currently it's just an array, so maybe it's not correct. Because, for example, here you can still provide an ability to specify the wrong data type for the same key. For example, you have like I don't know.
No, wait, you can't here. It is if you do that in this at this moment it is automatically casted. So I show you because it's covered even by integration tests. So in this case, I'm injecting strings instead of one integer, one float, and one string, and they are split cases in test DTOs. Oh, I added. So if you see, you have int, float, and string, and when I run the create from array or get object data, as you can see, it's automatically casted.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not using assert equals, I'm using assert same. So now I'm automatically casting, otherwise I could trigger one exception.
But
if your concern is this one.
Yeah, but we potentially can get with issue like casting like
Yeah,
numbers to strings and vice versa.
So your idea is to merge two objects.
Yeah, but to merge two objects, we need to have kind of a strict contract for the second argument. I mean, for your array data. So.
Yeah. No, I mean, just to explain you what I mean is something like, let's say, this is the method you have. So subject data 1, subject data 2, and they're coming from the source object. So basically, you're doing something like this. So you're merging two objects. Or maybe we can do not using the array, because I understand your concern about the typing, but simply iterating all the getter methods and merging and injecting into the new object. If your problem is at contract level. Because otherwise there is no other way other than using the setter method, of course.
So actually, like, for example, guys from the PHP who created this PCR7, they decided
sorry, because
that
I'm not very. I know about PSR7, but I never had the time or the opportunity to. No, this is HTTP message interface, so this is not the right one. If you can share something or explain me,
yeah, sure.
Because I just knew something. I just know something about PSR7, but
let me share my screen.
Let's say I just heard about it. This is.
No worries. We can discuss it right now. Not sure whether you see my screen. Click here to switch the screen.
Yep, you can see it.
You can see it. Yep. And maybe
Very. Yes. Okay. This was the page. Yeah. Okay.
So, like in the scope of the PCR7 proposal, it was proposed to introduce a set of immutable interfaces. Like, let me see. Yeah, here you can see all these interfaces, like interface for message, interface for HTTP request, and so on and so forth. And actually, the main idea when you would like to update something in the source code, you actually call the with method, and the with method actually accept parameter which should be changed, so that inside the implementation it just clones the object and update particular parameter and return the new version of this object. So in fact, if you will chain this update to the request method, it will produce you 3 different objects. Like the first one here, the clone and update with option, then update with asterisk, and then update with the URI, so that we are cloning like objects 3 times here and applying the changes. So this is how it's supposed to keep the immutability on the level of interface. But the penalty.
This is the penalty is that you're going to mess with memory.
So this actually is pretty much so probably like if we will go with immutable DTO, so probably it's better to create them PCR7 compliant. And not to introduce own solution, because probably guys from the PHP world would be not really satisfied. But you can look through the discussion around the PCR7 because actually it's time and memory consuming because of the way how that we need to recreate objects many times. And
unless we, as I told you before, we create a new object and destroy the previous one. We can save memory. Of course, we cannot save time.
Yeah, so actually you can see how it actually happens here. So they describe like with add header, so the immutability of message and must return an instance that has the new header and O value.
Yeah, and we can do this. So your idea basically is to create something like an interceptor, like what you do with the interceptor. Yeah.
So here we can think whether we can do it more efficiently, because potentially it can do I don't like the idea with an array, because we are losing the contract and we have this kind of magical transition. But I don't want to introduce, because potentially what we could do, we can introduce the object for setting values like the mutable, but for setting values for immutable. But I believe that will introduce too many mess, and people will start using this.
We could even use something in the middle, like a DTO modification transaction. So basically, we could call all the with method. So we are sure that the contract is satisfied. Then we call a kind of apply.
But where we
because this will save, of course, us from updating the object as many times as we need to update one single attribute.
So we need to
because we could do. Sorry.
Actually, here are just two options. So whether we are applying all the particular change immediately, or we are introducing kind of unit of work object which will keep all the changes, and just at the end of scenario we will apply all of them and proceed the DTO. So actually there are just two approaches. The first one is more time consuming and the memory consuming, because we're supposed to recreate the object each time when some of the extension attribute is beyond actually when all the attributes is beyond change. So we need to recreate the object, like the whole object. And the second but what's the pros of this approach, that we are not introducing any additional contract, like a container for all the changes to be applied for this DTO. So the second approach is that we need to introduce kind of intermediate container, which is supposed to accept all this, all the data beyond modified, and then
keep it in memory and then apply. Yeah, and then apply at once.
So we can now we can theoretically discuss both of these approaches and check which one most suitable for Magenta, because even though because currently it looks like maybe PCR7 approach looks better for us, but I'm not sure whether it would be applicable for Magenta because of the time, because potentially we can get too many performance degradation.
Yeah, even because you can even have huge objects.
Yep,
because imagine you want to create a product immutable DTO.
Yeah, exactly. So
memory hell.
Yeah, just try to apply the approach, for example, for the product model, and if you'll see that because I barely sure that the approach with the PCR7, when we recreate the whole model each time when the attribute is modified, will work for the product model, because we have too many modification of the product entity, so that potentially it can go to the memory hell.
Mm-hmm. But what is that? What do you think about my previous option of it's just a brainstorming, of course. If we keep on the array, that basically is the yeah, I know it's ugly, but it's the more time effective probably, and the memory effective. And we.
But
yeah.
why in this case array, but not, let's say, mutable entity DTO? So that, for example, you can have the DTO with just getters and DTO with setters and with the method get all data, so that you will build this setter DTO, and all the code which is supposed to modify the entity will actually modify not the real DTO, but the DTO with setters, and then you will put to your factory like the real DTO and the setter DTO, and from the setter DTO we will just call the get all data.
So I'm sorry, say again, because I think I got lost at the second get all data.
I will write in a code. So do you see my screen now?
Yeah, I have only a problem that I see your screen very stretched. I don't know if you share two monitors or there is something wrong.
Do you see it now? It's supposed to be PHP Storm.
Yeah, I know it's supposed to be PHP Storm, but seems maybe there is something wrong in my blue jeans. Yeah, it seems to be something. Can you stop the sharing and start it again? Because maybe
okay.
I think okay, because I think it was stick to my previous window size. Yeah, much better now.
So
okay.
Let's consider what I meant, that for example we have like a class DTO. So this is like immutable DTO.
Uh-huh.
And for example we have here like a public get some entity, I don't know.
Okay.
And here we have class mutable DTO. So with method, so there is no get method. Public function set. I mean like a set a here.
Mm-hmm.
And here we let's say return integer, so that here we'll have like a int, I don't know, a. And here would be, for this mutable DTO, would be public function get data, which will return the array of the whole data. So that
so it is the opposite of the current implementation of the simple abstract objects. The opposite way, basically.
And that would be opposite way to the array, because here we have the precise contract, and here we still this get data which returns the array.
Mm-hmm.
But so because like a mutable DTO is better than just an array, because we can track the contract, and we can be more strict here, because this is an object but not just an array with the data. And currently we will have the factory method, probably something like that, like factory create based on the immutable DTO object and the mutable DTO object.
But I don't see any advantage, honestly, because it is the same of using the PSR7 approach with the apply method. Because basically, and the end it is the same, because you are going to use set instead of with and get data instead of apply.
The difference is that, for example, if we have like several setters here, like let's say A and B, and B, so that if we want to modify both A and B, what we will do here, we will like set A and specify like 10. At this point, we are not creating a new instance. We do
I know.
actually
I
nothing.
understood this, but I mean, we could do the same using the with approach, and instead of creating, so basically the with approach is basically one setter like you did here. The only difference is that we can get the new immutable DTO by calling, let's say not get data, but get DTO, let's say something like this, or apply changes or something like that, because at computational level they are almost the same.
Mm-hmm.
So my idea is to, let's say we create, let's say one class that is named DTO. Okay, so through code generation we can, well, DTO, let's say it's product. Okay, the class is product. At code generation time we define that product immutable DTO automatically creates this DTO class at code generation level that is adding one with method for each getter, let's say, and one apply method. Okay, this is just a name. It can be, of course, different. And this new code-generated class is basically embedding the previous immutable object and proxying all the getters and creating the object only when you call the apply method. So basically you can change using with, and this container class keeps in mind everything you want to change, but it clones the object only when you apply.
But how you specify the value for, like, are you specifying the value with object, like with method, or like?
Yeah, with a with. So for example, here I have with a, and there is a with a method that is automatically generated in the container class.
Yeah, but so you propose that, for example, if we have here with, so whether we have the clone method here, like clone.
No, not here, not here. So basically here with a is just like a setter. So we have a private variable, let's say
But,
temporary data.
what the difference? What the difference in this case would be comparing with existing approach where we have just clear setters?
What is clear setters? No,
I
yeah, okay.
mean, like,
No, the difference basically is that you well, actually
yeah.
it's the same approach as the PSR7 without cloning the object every time you call with.
But if we are getting like,
so the difference between the current implementation of the and this new one is that here when you call apply you have two objects.
But we
in the
can
previous
say
implementation
that,
you have the same.
But we can say that our objects are immutable anymore because we are changing their internal state with the with method.
No, we are going to change the internal state of the container, but this internal state is not visible from the external unless we call apply.
Actually, it does not like, because.
Yeah, I know. It's a very borderline immutability.
Yeah. Because you are just changing the private variable, so that which is not a which does not have a getter method, but it's still the update of the internal state.
Yeah. So basically, my approach is to use the mutable DTO inside your mutable DTO, not having them in two separate classes, but maybe having it, because having in two separate classes, I think, can be very confusing. This is my concern.
Yeah, that's I definitely agree with that. That's why I mentioned that this is probably the biggest drawback of this approach, and probably this is why guys from the PHP, when discussing the PCR7, decided that they don't want to do this, but they want to apply changes immediately and clone the new object and return it to the business code. So this is kind of So another option. So maybe it's not so bad for us. So that we will say that we don't want to apply the immutability approach for product entity. And the product entity supposed to be mutable because it is used currently in too much of the legacy code, which updated too many times.
Yeah.
But for example, for the new code we write, for pickup location, for example, it's pretty much okay to have the with method, which will just clone that entity because we have just one piece of business logic and just one snippet of code which modify the entity, so that we no need to modify it in many places of our business logic.
Yeah.
So maybe it's okay.
Yes. Yeah. Well, I think implementing this approach with, the PSR7 is quite easy. The only thing is that we have to engage the code generation. So we have to create a kind of suffix for DTOs, like DTO, for example, because we need to code generate the new class. And yeah, if we agree using DTO is fine. So I can create one entry in the code generation system, and whenever you just create one immutable DTO like the one I created, then you call, let's say, if we have source, if the name is source, we call source DTO, and we got this new immutable object with the with.
But do we really need to differentiate? Because currently we, for example, have the DTO currently we have just the source interface and the source implementation. Should we introduce separately source DTO?
And I am thinking how to create it using the code generation, because the code generation is based on suffix.
Yeah, I mean whether we will be using source separately out of the source DTO.
So you mean you have source interface and source DTO?
Yeah.
Two different classes. Does it make sense?
No, you mentioned that. That's why I'm recalling whether your intention to introduce two different entities, source and source DTO, because from my perspective,
No. No, I mean, no. My point is just a technical point. I have to find a way how to engage the code generation without using a suffix. That is the point, because of course, if we need to introduce the with methods, we have to code generate, of course. But I cannot engage code generation without a suffix, I think, at least as far as I know. Unless I found a way like you do with plugins using the interceptor. But I don't know how to do that, so I have to play. And another problem, we also have another problem, that currently we have the source interface, for example. Source is just to make an example. And we have getter method inside. Should we create the with method as part of the contract, of the service contract, I mean? It's a question, should we? So this is why I opted for this approach, because it allows you to not redefine any object. It's full backward compatible. That was the point. Because if we call the method with, I think we should even report in the interface.
Yeah, sure. So because like in the PCR7, all these methods are part of the interface. So that PCR7 just declares the interfaces, and you can see that all these methods are part of the interface.
Yeah, we can also think in a different way. So currently, do we need one interface for one DTO? I mean a real DTO. A DTO is one interface by itself.
Actually,
So,
I would even say that
because
DTO is implementation by itself, even without like separate interface ideally.
yeah, it's implement. Yeah, if we have the DTO implementation, could we even create the interface through code generation? Because if we have one immutable DTO, it's just made by private variables and one constructor and getters. It should be not represented by anything else. So we could create both the, let's say, with code generated part and interface containing the with methods. But it's going to totally change the approach we have, because you cannot make it backward compatible with the current implementation. And we should create some kind of marker interface to do that.
But you know, like I'm just thinking like, why do we need to change the DTO at all if you're talking about the CQRS system, so that we have the DTO which is supposed to be just a read-only, and for all the modification we're supposed to create a command which should modify particular data in the scope of the entity. So that why do we need to modify the immutable object at all? For example, like we have the pickup location, which is supposed to be always immutable on a front end. And if you want to change something in the pickup location, we have the source entity, and we can proceed with creating the command on the source entity. And the pickup location would be updated like as a result of this change. If we want to update like I don't know, stock data, we'll also create like this is pretty common for the event sourcing. We're not updating the entity, but we issue a command object which updates the entity as a result. So that I'm not really sure that we need to provide the possibility of the mutable entities at all, but instead we supposed to issue a command which will like apply some changes which will affect that entity when that entity would be like retrieved next time.
Okay, but how do you solve in this case? So using an external command, I don't understand how you can guarantee the service contract of the property you're going to change.
Yeah, so this is the responsibility of the command object which gonna be created in this case. So the command object.
Just to understand, so basically, if you need to change let's say one property of this immutable DTO, you're going to create one command that is updating this single attribute and returning the new object. So basically, it's a with method outside the DTO itself. Is that correct?
Say it again, please.
So basically, you're saying if I want to change one immutable object, so I need to update something inside an immutable object.
But actually, okay.
So let's say I want to inject more than update, because you're supposed not to update an immutable DTO. So you want to inject something. You're going to create one external command that is adding this property or replacing the property and cloning the object. Is that correct? So basically, it's what the with method does, but outside the DTO.
Yeah. So probably in this case, probably in this case you're supposed to have like a kind of mutable version of the entity, which would be.
I'm thinking we could merge what you said before about having two objects and my idea of code generating, because basically what you mean is to having one external command to update one single attribute, but we could create one external immutable DTO that basically is a copy of our immutable DTO with the with methods. And we could use code generation. So basically it's one idea in the middle of the one you had by creating the two objects, so the mutable and immutable version, and mine using the code generation for injecting the with. So basically you have the immutable object, and then you can call the immutable object with some suffix that is going just to provide the with methods. So basically you can update it, and you guarantee that the immutable object is immutable.
My main point here is that probably we try to avoid, because what you are trying to do is you're trying to provide the scenarios when we are creating the DTO object and we want to modify it. So that my point here is that if we created the DTO object, it's supposed to be used just for the read scenarios, like for the query scenarios on the front end. So we not supposed to modify it here. And if we have the scenario where we want to modify the entity, probably we no need to create the readable object at all.
Yeah, no, that was my initial point. That was my initial point, that one immutable object should be immutable. So,
sorry, Ricardo, I have like another conclusion.
Yeah, no, okay, yeah, okay.
Can we like we can? So this is pretty much like this is very interesting discussion for me. So we can schedule it for tomorrow if you have time for tomorrow, or like later this week, so we can continue discussion of this approach.
Yeah, sure.
And I will, so I will also have some time to think a little bit about this issue and how it could be solved.
Okay, I will play some experiments in the meanwhile.
Yeah. So,
okay.
Thank you for your update. Yeah, definitely need to proceed further on this direction. Thank you for your time.
Great. Bye-bye.
Yeah, bye.